This 1888 portrait of a stable boy looks proud until you notice the brand. At first glance, the photograph shows nothing unusual. A young black man in work clothes, standing tall beside a horse, his posture confident. The kind of image you might scroll past in a museum archive without a second thought. But one detail in this photograph would unravel a carefully buried history of exploitation that stretched decades past the end of the Civil War. And the story of how it was found begins not in 1888, but in a climate-controlled basement in Atlanta on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday afternoon. Miriam Okonkwo had been cataloging photographs for the Southeastern Regional History Collection for 11 years. In that time, she had processed over 40,000 images, daguerreotypes, tintypes, albumin prints, cabinet cards. She had seen photos of plantation owners posed with the people they enslaved. She had seen chain gangs and convict laborers. She had developed what she called a professional numbness, the ability to document horror with steady hands and return home to cook dinner without falling apart. It was not coldness. It was survival. The photograph arrived in a lot purchased from the estate of a deceased collector in rural Georgia. The man had spent 50 years accumulating images of agricultural life in the postbellum South, and his heirs wanted nothing to do with any of it. The collection filled 16 archival boxes. Most of it was routine: tobacco harvests, cotton gins, mule teams, plantation houses photographed for insurance purposes, the kind of material that would be useful to researchers but would never make anyone's heart race. Miriam found the stable boy photograph in box 11, sandwiched between a portrait of a prize stallion and a blurred image of what appeared to be a horse race. The cabinet card measured roughly 4 by 6 inches. The photographic studio's stamp on the back read, J.T. Harlan, Fine Portraiture, Macon, Georgia. A handwritten date in faded pencil, July 1888. The subject stood in the standard three-quarter pose of the era. He wore a clean white shirt, suspenders, and dark trousers. His left hand rested on the bridle of a handsome bay horse. His right arm hung at his side, relaxed. He looked directly at the camera with an expression that Miriam at first read as pride, maybe even defiance. His jaw was set, his shoulders were squared. This was not the submissive posture that white photographers often demanded from black subjects in this period. She noted the image in her intake log, assigned it a catalog number, and was about to move on to the next photograph when something made her pause. She looked again at the young man's right arm. His sleeve was rolled up to the elbow, which was slightly unusual for a formal portrait. And there, on the inside of his forearm, was a mark. Miriam pulled a magnifying loupe from her desk drawer and leaned in. The mark was small, maybe 1.5 inches across, and the photographic grain made it difficult to resolve at first. But as her eyes adjusted, the shape became unmistakable. It was a brand, a scar in the distinct shape of a letter. The raised tissue caught the studio light just enough to stand out from the surrounding skin. The letter appeared to be a C. She sat back in her chair. Branding had been common during slavery, but this photograph was dated 1888, 23 years after emancipation. She looked at the young man's face again, and this time his expression seemed different. Not pride, something harder to name. A kind of controlled stillness, like someone waiting to see what would happen next. Miriam had processed images of branding before, always in the context of antebellum slavery. But those images came with documentation that made their context clear. This photograph had nothing but a studio stamp and a date. If the date was accurate, then this young man had been branded after the 13th Amendment was supposed to have freed him. And if that was true, then this was not just a photograph. It was evidence. She knew she should finish cataloging the lot. She had a system and a schedule and a grant deadline in 3 weeks. But she also knew that if she filed this image without investigating further, she would be doing exactly what generations of archivists had done before her. She would be making the violence invisible by making it administrative. She pulled the photograph from the stack and set it aside on her desk. Then she began to search. The photographer, J.T. Harlan, proved relatively easy to trace. Macon city directories from the 1880s listed his studio at 412 Cherry Street. Local newspaper advertisements confirmed that he specialized in portraits of fine horses and the men who care for them. This was unusual language for the era. Most white photographers who worked with black subjects did not market their services this way. Harlan seemed to have carved out a niche photographing the stable workers and horse trainers who were essential to Georgia's agricultural economy, but rarely appeared in the formal photographic record. Miriam contacted Dr. Raymond Watkins, a historian at a university in Atlanta who specialized in labor practices in the postbellum South. She sent him a high-resolution scan of the photograph and asked if he could help her understand what she was seeing. His reply came within the hour. "Call me," he wrote. "This is significant." On the phone, Dr. Watkins explained that while branding was technically illegal after emancipation, it continued in various forms well into the 20th century. The convict leasing system, which allowed Southern states to lease prisoners to private businesses, was one avenue. Prisoners, the vast majority of whom were black men arrested on minor or fabricated charges, were often branded by the companies that leased them. The brands indicated which plantation, mine, or lumber camp the prisoner was assigned to. Some brands were initials, some were numbers, some were symbols. The letter C could stand for a number of things, Dr. Watkins said. A company name, a county, a specific plantation. I'd need to know more about who this young man was and where he came from. Miriam turned the photograph over. On the back, beneath the studio stamp, she found something she had initially overlooked. A name, written in pencil so faint it was nearly illegible. Samuel B. to Collier. "Collier," she said aloud. Dr. Watkins was quiet for a moment. "There was a Collier plantation in Baldwin County," he said finally. "Big operation, cotton and timber. The family was prominent before the war. Afterward, they transitioned to tenant farming and convict leasing. They were one of the larger lessees in that part of the state." Miriam felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came when a research trail suddenly opened up. "So the brand could have been the Collier mark," she said. "Possibly. If this young man was leased to the Collier operation, they may have branded him as property. It was illegal, but it was common. The state looked the other way." She asked if there would be records. Dr. Watkins said that convict leasing records were notoriously incomplete. Many had been destroyed, either deliberately or through neglect. But Baldwin County had been the subject of a federal investigation in the 1890s, and some of those records had survived. They were held in the state archives in Atlanta. Miriam requested copies the next morning. The records arrived 3 weeks later, scanned and emailed in a series of massive PDF files. Miriam spent an entire weekend scrolling through handwritten ledgers, typed reports, and faded correspondence. The documents painted a picture of a system designed to re-enslave black men under the cover of law. Men were arrested for vagrancy, for loitering, for suspicious behavior. They were tried in courts where they had no representation and sentenced to terms that could stretch for years. Then they were leased to private businesses that worked them in conditions indistinguishable from slavery. The Collier plantation appeared repeatedly in the records. The family had leased an average of 40 to 60 convicts per year between 1875 and 1895. The mortality rate among leased convicts on the Collier property was noted in one federal inspector's report as higher than average for the region, a euphemism that Miriam understood to mean catastrophic. She found no direct mention of anyone named Samuel. But she found something almost as useful. A partial list of convicts leased to the Collier operation in 1882, 6 years before the photograph was taken. The list included physical descriptions. One entry read, "Samuel, Negro, age approx. 14, arrested Macon, vagrancy, sentenced 7 years, assigned Collier Timber Camp No. 3. Miriam calculated the dates. If Samuel had been 14 in 1882, he would have been approximately 20 in 1888. The young man in the photograph looked about that age, and if he had served a 7-year sentence, he would have been released in 1889, 1 year after the photograph was taken. But the photograph showed him working as a stable boy, not laboring in a timber camp. She called Dr. Watkins again. He explained that convict leasing contracts often included provisions for good behavior transfers. Convicts who proved cooperative or who had skills that plantation owners valued could be reassigned from hard labor camps to less brutal positions. Stable work was considered a privileged assignment. It suggested that Samuel had survived the timber camp and been moved to work with the Collier family's horses. But he was still a convict, Dr. Watkins said. Still property of the state, leased to a private family. He would have had no wages, no freedom of movement, no legal rights, and the brand would have marked him as belonging to that system for the rest of his life. Miriam looked at the photograph again. She thought about what it would mean to stand in a photographer's studio, wearing clean clothes for perhaps the first time in years, posing beside a horse you had been trained to care for, and knowing that the scar on your arm told the real story. She wondered if Samuel had chosen to roll up his sleeve. She wondered if the photograph had been his way of leaving a record. The Collier family was not difficult to trace. Their descendants still lived in Baldwin County, and several of them were prominent in local business and politics. The family had donated land for a county park and funded a wing of the regional hospital. A street in the county seat bore their name. Their history, as presented in local museums and commemorative plaques, focused on their contributions to the community. The convict leasing operation was not mentioned. Miriam knew that contacting the family directly would be complicated. She was not a journalist. She was an archivist. Her job was to preserve and describe, not to investigate or expose. But she also knew that the photograph had come to her, and that she had a responsibility to understand it fully before she cataloged it for public access. She reached out to Dr. Angela Simmons, a genealogist who specialized in tracing African American families through the gaps in official records. Dr. Simmons agreed to help search for any descendants of Samuel who might still be living. The search took months. Dr. Simmons combed through census records, church registries, and Freedmen's Bureau files. She found that a man named Samuel Collier, the surname indicating he had been associated with the Collier property, had appeared in the 1900 census as a resident of Macon. His occupation was listed as hostler, a word for someone who cares for horses at an inn or stable. He was married to a woman named Esther, and they had 3 children. The 1910 census showed the family still in Macon. Samuel's occupation was now listed as livery stable proprietor. He had somehow managed to start his own business. But the 1920 census told a different story. Samuel was gone. Esther was listed as a widow. The children, now young adults, had scattered to different cities. Dr. Simmons traced one branch of the family to Chicago, where Samuel's youngest son, James, had moved during the Great Migration. James had children, who had children, who had children. One of his great-great-grandchildren, a woman named Denise Collier Washington, was now living in suburban Atlanta, less than an hour from Miriam's archive. Miriam wrote to her. The letter she received in return was cautious, but curious. Denise wrote that her family had always known they were descended from someone who had been connected to a plantation in Georgia, but the details had been lost over generations. She had never seen a photograph of Samuel. She did not know about the brand. Miriam invited her to the archive. The meeting took place on a Thursday afternoon. Denise arrived with her adult daughter, her mother, and an uncle who had driven down from Chicago specifically for the occasion. Miriam had printed a large format copy of the photograph and placed it in a viewing room with soft lighting and comfortable chairs. When Denise saw the image, she was quiet for a long time. Her mother reached out and touched the edge of the print, as if she could reach through it to the young man standing beside the horse. The uncle leaned in to look at the brand, then sat back and removed his glasses to wipe his eyes. "We knew," the mother said finally. "We knew something bad had happened, but we didn't know it was like this." Miriam explained what she had learned about the convict leasing system, about the Collier plantation, about the records that documented Samuel's arrest and sentencing. She showed them the ledger entries, the federal reports, the mortality statistics. She told them that Samuel had survived, had built a business, had raised a family. She told them that the photograph might have been his way of making sure the truth was not completely erased. Denise asked if the archive would be displaying the photograph. Miriam said that was complicated. The photograph was part of a collection that had been donated with certain restrictions. The Collier family, the White Colliers, had been major donors to the institution that housed the archive. Any public display of material that reflected poorly on their ancestors would need to be approved by the museum's board. "So they still control the story," Denise said. It was not a question. Miriam did not have a good answer. The board meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening in October. Miriam had prepared a presentation that included the photograph, the research she had conducted, and a proposal for how the image might be displayed as part of a larger exhibition on labor and exploitation in the postbellum South. She had invited Dr. Watkins and Dr. Simmons to attend as expert witnesses. She had also invited Denise, though she warned her that the meeting might be contentious. The board was composed of 12 members, most of them white, most of them over 60. Several had connections to old Georgia families. One, a man named Howard Collier III, was a direct descendant of the family that had operated the plantation. The presentation went smoothly at first. The board members listened politely as Miriam described the photograph in its context. They nodded when Dr. Watkins explained the convict leasing system. They took notes when Dr. Simmons described the genealogical research that had led to Denise's family. Then Howard Collier III raised his hand. "I appreciate the thoroughness of this research," he said, "but I have to ask whether we're certain about the interpretation. This photograph shows a young man working with horses. It doesn't prove he was mistreated. The mark on his arm could be anything. A scar from an accident. A birthmark. We're making a lot of assumptions based on very little evidence." Miriam kept her voice steady. "The shape of the mark is consistent with branding. The letter C is consistent with the Collier plantation's documented practice of branding leased convicts. The notation on the back of the photograph connects the subject to the Collier property, and the convict leasing records include an individual named Samuel, who matches the subject's apparent age and location. But you don't have a document that says, 'We branded this specific person,'" Collier said. "You're connecting dots that might not be connected." Dr. Watkins spoke up. "With respect, Mr. Collier, that's how historical research works. We rarely have a smoking gun. We have patterns, corroborations, and reasonable inferences. The pattern here is clear. Your ancestors participated in a system that re-enslaved black men through the criminal justice system. This photograph is evidence of that system's violence." The room was silent. Howard Collier III's face had gone red. Another board member, a woman who ran a local historical society, cleared her throat and said that perhaps they should table the discussion until they had more time to review the materials. Denise stood up. She had not been invited to speak, but no one stopped her. "My family has lived with the consequences of what happened to Samuel for 5 generations, she said. "We lost our history. We lost our connection to where we came from. We didn't even have a photograph. And now that we finally have one, you want to debate whether the scar on his arm is really a brand? That man is my ancestor. He survived something that was designed to kill him, and he left this photograph so that someone, someday, would know the truth. You don't get to decide whether his story is convenient enough to tell." The vote was held the following month. The board approved the exhibition by a margin of 7-5. Howard Collier III resigned from the board 2 weeks later, citing differences in vision for the institution's future. The exhibition opened the following spring. Photograph of Samuel was displayed alongside the convict leasing records, the genealogical research, and a video interview with Denise and her family. The wall text did not soften the story. It explained that the young man in the photograph had been arrested at 14, leased to a private plantation, branded like livestock, and forced to work without pay for 7 years. It explained that he had survived, built a business, raised a family, and that his descendants were still seeking the full truth of what had been done to him. The exhibition drew more visitors in its first month than the archive typically saw in a year. Local news covered the opening. National outlets picked up the story. Historians who studied convict leasing reached out to Miriam to ask about the photograph and the records she had found. But the response was not universally positive. The archive received angry letters from people who accused the staff of attacking Southern heritage. Someone vandalized the sign outside the building. A state legislator gave a speech criticizing the exhibition as politically motivated historical revisionism. The Collier family released a statement expressing disappointment that the archive had chosen to sensationalize their ancestors' legacy. Miriam kept working. She knew that the backlash was part of the story, evidence that the systems she was trying to expose were still defended by people who benefited from them. She also knew that the photograph had done what Samuel might have hoped it would do. It had forced people to see what they had been trained to overlook. In the months that followed, she began to receive emails and letters from other researchers who had found similar photographs, images of men and women in the post-bellum South whose postures, expressions, or physical marks hinted at violence that the official captions denied. A photograph of a domestic servant with scarring on her wrists posed beside the white children she cared for. A portrait of a field hand whose bare feet showed the marks of shackles, a cabinet card of a young girl whose eyes were focused on something outside the frame, something that the camera could not capture, but that she clearly could not forget. Each photograph was a fragment of a larger picture, and the larger picture was a system that had been designed to make its own violence invisible. Photographs had been part of that design. They had been used to present exploitation as order, captivity as employment, trauma as contentment, but the bodies in those photographs had resisted in the only way available to them. They had left clues, scars, expressions, postures that did not quite match the story the photographer wanted to tell. Miriam thought often about the moment when Samuel had stood in J.T. Harlan's studio. She imagined the photographer arranging the scene, positioning the horse, adjusting the light. She imagined Samuel being told to stand still, to look at the camera, to hold his arm just so. And she imagined the decision he had made, whether conscious or instinctive, to roll up his sleeve, to let the brand show, to make sure that anyone who looked closely enough would know that this portrait of a proud stable boy was also a portrait of something else entirely. The photograph hangs in the archive now, in a permanent display. Beside it is a placard that tells Samuel's story. Visitors stop in front of it, read the text, and look at the young man's face. Some of them see the brand immediately. Others take a while to notice it, but once they see it, they cannot unsee it. And that, Miriam has come to believe, is the point. We are surrounded by photographs from this era. They hang in museums, appear in textbooks, and fill the collections of families who believe they are preserving their heritage. Most of them look ordinary. Most of them show well-dressed people in formal poses, displaying the respectability and prosperity of their time. But respectability and prosperity in this era were often built on violence, and the people who suffered that violence sometimes found ways to leave their mark on the record. The next time you see an old photograph, look closely. Look at the hands, look at the feet, look at the background, the reflections, the objects that seem incidental. Look at the faces of the people who were not supposed to be the subject of the image, but who were there anyway, standing at the edge of the frame or seated in the corner, their presence required, but their humanity denied. Some of those photographs are exactly what they appear to be, but some of them are evidence, and if we look carefully enough, some aged people in them can finally be seen.